Thank you. You may be seated. Haven't we had a great service already this morning? Hadn't it been great? I hope you still feel that way after I finish my sermon in a few minutes. I know that last Sunday morning we went over just a little bit of time, and next week I'm going to have us right on time. But in order for us to get out of here at 11:30, we just have to stand and sing the closing hymn and have the benediction, because we're already at that point. And gosh, I wrote this sermon, and I just want to share it with you. So, hey, if you'll just be a little patient with me, we're going to run just a little bit over again this morning. Have you ever noticed how names can be interesting? I have a friend who tells of a friend of hers who, when she was born into a family that had the last name Peabody. And she was given the name Phoebe, and her middle initial was B, so her name was Phoebe B. Peabody. Well, when she grew up, she moved to England, and in a particular section of England where she moved, instead of pronouncing her last name Peabody like we do here in the United States, they pronounced it Peabody. So her name was Phoebe B. Peabody. Well, not long after she moved to England, she met a man, and eventually she married him, and he had a very distinguished last English name. It was the name Beebe, B-E-E-B-E. And in the particular section of England where she moved, it was customary when a woman married for her to retain her maiden name as well as taking on the new name. Some of you are ahead of me. So whenever she was asked what her name was, she would simply say, well, my name is Phoebe B. Peabody Beebe. Try saying that 3 times real fast. Names can be interesting, can't they? Last Sunday morning after the worship service was over, many of you stood in that long reception line. Thank you for doing that. That meant more to us than you could ever begin to know. And when we had a chance to greet one another, many of you had some very interesting names. And when I had a chance to ask you, you told me some very interesting stories that lay behind those names. I remember some of those stories. Now, I'm still having a hard time putting the stories and the names with the faces, but give me a little bit of time and I'll be able to do that. Names can be interesting. Not only that, but they can be insightful and inspirational as well. Take my name, Dan. My name comes from one of the 12 tribes of Israel, and it literally means God is my judge. And I think I was about 14 or 15 years of age when I first learned the meaning of my name. Can you understand what I mean when I say to you that for the last 40 plus years, I have been living with that? I have been trying to make sure that it is God to whom I turn to be the judge of my life, and not simply other people. I've been trying to live up to the meaning of that name. Of course, there's no name more inspirational and insightful than is the name of God. "O Lord, our Lord," cried the psalmist, "how majestic is your name in all the earth." Well, one of the names by which God is called is the name Jehovah Jireh. Now, the word Jehovah Jireh literally means the Lord will provide. And that was why I asked Lane, when he read the Old Testament lesson for this morning, to insert the Hebrew footnote that is in most of your translations down at the bottom, the name Jehovah Jireh. And most of your translations, it simply says the Lord will provide. But the Hebrew word is Jehovah Jireh. Now, you know where that name comes from. You know the background of that name because we read it together a few minutes ago. You will remember that way back in the book of Genesis, Abraham and Sarah wanted to have children, and so they tried and waited, but there was no child. So they tried again and waited, but there was no child. They tried again and waited, and still there was no child, and so eventually they gave up on the prospect of ever even having a child. And then one day, God came to them and said, "Guess what? You're going to have a baby." Well, by that time, they were so advanced in years that they began to laugh hysterically. But wonder of wonders, miracle of miracles, in a few months they gave birth to a baby and they named him Isaac. He was everything they could have ever hoped or wanted or dreamed. However, a few years later, God once again came to Abraham, and this time he said, Abraham, I want you to take your son, your only son, Isaac, the one whom you love, and I want you to go up to Mount Moriah, and there I want you to sacrifice him. Now, it's sort of interesting the way that God, or the writer has God say this to Abraham. I want you to take your son, your only son, the one whom you love. It's almost as if he's beating it into him over and over and over again. How difficult and painful this experience is going to be. Personally, I can't even begin to imagine how Abraham must have felt in that moment. I have a son. I have only one son. And I can't begin to imagine what it must have been like for Abraham to get that word from God. Now, it's precisely here that a lot of us, I think, get stuck with this story. As Adam Hamilton pointed out a few weeks ago when he stood right about where I'm standing now, a lot of us in here have a very difficult time reconciling the picture of God that we get from this story in the book of Genesis with the picture of God we get in the life and ministry and teachings and so forth of Jesus, and understandably so. But this morning I want to ask you to do something. Just for this morning, I want to ask you to suspend your questions about this part of the story so that we can focus upon another part of the story. For our purposes this morning, can we all simply agree that this was how the writer of Genesis understood what was taking place, even if we still struggle to make sense of all of this? Well, in any case, we're told that Abraham loaded up Isaac and the wood and the knife and the provision for fire, and they headed out to Mount Moriah. And when they had gone as far as they could go on their donkeys, they stopped, dismounted, and Abraham gave Isaac the wood and the knife, and then he took the provision for fire, and they walked closer to the place of sacrifice. Now, about this time, Isaac must have sensed that something was going on, because we're told that at one point he turned to his father and he said, Daddy, we've got the fire, we've got the wood, we've got the knife, but where's the sacrifice? And of course you remember Abraham responded by simply saying, don't worry about it. The Lord is going to provide. And when they finally get to the place of sacrifice, we're told that Abraham fixed the wood and then he bound up Isaac. And I've always kind of wondered about that part of the story. How did he do that? Did Isaac understand what was going on? Did Isaac resist? Did Isaac try to run away? We don't know. The Bible doesn't tell us. All we know is that Abraham fixed the altar, bound up Isaac, laid him on it, and then he lifted the knife. But wonder of wonders, miracle of miracles, at that very moment there was the sound of a ram in the thicket. And Abraham had his sacrifice. So, to remember this whole experience, Abraham named that place after the name of God. Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. You know, sometimes it can take a lot of faith to believe that the Lord will provide, can it? Certainly this must have been the case for Abraham the whole time that they were headed out to Mount Moriah, the whole time that he was fixing the altar and laying Isaac on it, the whole time that he was lifting the knife. It must have taken an incredible amount of faith for Abraham to believe that the Lord would provide. And even though our situations are seldom as dramatic or as intense as was Abraham's, the same is true for us. Sometimes it takes a lot of faith to believe that the Lord will provide. I remember when Carol and I gave birth to our daughter, Catherine. Well, I say we gave birth. Actually, Carol did most of the work. but I did some of the worrying. And when we had waited for 9 long months for her, and when she came, we were thrilled beyond years. Carol stayed a couple of more days in the hospital after she was born, and then when it came time to leave, they wrapped up that little bundle of joy and they handed her to Carol, and we got in the car and we started to head for home. At the time, we lived in Thomaston, Georgia, and Carol delivered at what was then Crawford Long Hospital, today Emory Midtown. So it was about a 40 or 50 mile trip, and we got onto I-75 and we started down south, and then when we got to the south side of Atlanta, we took the 1941 turnoff and we went down that road about halfway. And about that time, Carol began to have a little bit of an anxiety attack. She began to say, I've never been a mother before. What am I going to do if something happens? What am I going to do if she hurts herself? What am I going to do if she gets sick? What am I going to do? And at one point, it just got so intense that I had to pull the car off on the side of the road, and I turned to her and I said, honey, I don't know why you're asking me these questions. I've never been a mother before. And at the time, we were so green. We had no idea what we were doing. But wonder of wonders, miracle of miracles, the Lord provided. And as Neil Purcell pointed out last week, now my daughter is not only a grown woman, but married, and today is the 3rd birthday of her son, our grandson. The Lord had provided. I remember a time a few years after that, when Carol and I were sitting on the floor of our bedroom with our backs against the bed. At the time, our kids were just little guys, and I was serving a church that couldn't afford to pay me enough to live on, for my family to live on. There really are churches like that. And we were about 2 weeks into the month, which meant that we still had 2 weeks before we would get paid again, and we had come to the end of our resources. And when I say we had come to the end of our resources, I don't mean that we had come to the end of our money and then we could turn to family or friends and ask for some help. We had come to the end of our resources. And so as we sat there on the floor with our backs against the bed, tears streaming down Carol's face and me wringing my hands with worry, I remember about that time, our then 5-year-old daughter, Catherine, came walking into our bedroom with her little pink piggy bank. And as only a 5-year-old little girl can do, she said something to the effect, "Here, maybe this can help." Now, if you've ever been in that situation, then you know that at one and the same time, it thrilled us that she had captured that sense of the spirit that is one of the great spirits that makes life worth living, the spirit of generosity. And yet at the same time, it broke our hearts that we were in the kind of situation where she felt the need to do that. Besides, I knew that what she had in her piggy bank wouldn't help much. I'd already robbed the piggy bank on a couple of other occasions. We had no idea how we were going to make it, but wonder of wonders, miracle of miracles, the Lord provided. Sometimes when you're facing a situation and you don't know how it's going to work out, it takes a lot of faith to believe that the Lord will provide. But the truth of the matter is, the Lord always, 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 always provides, even if it sometimes seems that He has not provided. Back a bunch of years ago, Carol's father was diagnosed with lung cancer. And back then, we didn't know as much about that devil as we know today. Medical research has come light years in their understanding of all kinds of cancers and in the treatment of all kinds of cancers. But back then, they didn't know as much as they know today. But we did everything we knew to do to try and help the situation. We took him to the best doctors. We read everything we could read about lung cancer. We had him put on prayer lists all over North Georgia and around the country. We prayed for him. We anointed his head with oil. We asked God to heal him. And guess what? He died. He died. And at the time, I was so young and so naive in my faith, I thought it was because God had not answered our prayers. Now, God and I have always had a very, what I call an enthusiastic prayer life. I'm brutally honest. God knows everything anyway. You might as well tell him the truth. I'm brutally honest with what's going on in my life with God, and especially when I have questions like that. And so for about 6-8 months, something like that, I just on a regular basis, I sort of questioned God the way that Job questioned God. How could you let this happen? Don't you know how much he meant to us? Don't you understand how we need him and what a good man he is? How could you let this sort of thing happen? And for a long time, God listened but said nothing. God just let me vent. And then one day during our devotional time together, here's the key, when I was ready, God spoke and I listened. And this is essentially what I heard God saying. Dan, you're right. I didn't give your father-in-law a physical healing. Physical healings are great. Physical healings are wonderful, and it's what everybody wants, but physical healings are always only temporary. Instead, I did something even more significant for your father-in-law. I gave him a complete healing, one that would last for all eternity. And guess what, Dan? I still have enough grace left over to heal you and your family of your hurt, if you will let me. And in time, that's exactly what God did. God healed us of our hurt. You see, God always, always, always provides, even when it sometimes seems that he hasn't. Now, sometimes you have to be on the other side of an experience before you can look back and see how God has provided. This, you remember, was the experience of the disciples time and time again. Jesus had tried to help them understand the direction that his life would take, namely that he would go to Jerusalem, be killed, or suffer and be killed. And time again, Jesus said, but the Lord will provide. However, each time, the disciples replied by saying, no, you don't have to do that. We're not going to let them do that to you. And then when he shared his last supper with them, he took the bread and he broke it. And he said, this is my body, which is broken for you. And then he took the cup and he lifted it and he said, this is my blood, which is poured out for you. And you remember the disciples said, no, you don't have to do that. We're not going to let them do that to you. And then came the arrest, and the disciples did not understand. And then they brutally beat Jesus, and the disciples did not understand. And then they led him out to Calvary, and the disciples did not understand. And then they nailed him to the cross and lifted the cross in its place, and the disciples did not understand. And then Jesus breathed his last breath, and the disciples did not understand. But on the third day, when the stone was rolled back, and Jesus appeared to the disciples in the upper room, and he said, peace be with you. Then the disciples understood. They understood that God had not simply provided for the care of their friend. God had done something even more significant. He had provided for the salvation of the world. Now, let me try to bring this thing home and make an application. Although I'm new and I don't know most of your stories, my hunch is that there are at least a few people in here this morning who are going through some difficult situations in their personal lives. Maybe it's a financial struggle. Maybe there's a diagnosis from the doctor. Maybe it's a child who's facing a very serious situation. And you're asking the question, what are we going to do now? Or maybe you're one of those who does not like change. And now there's a change in senior leadership at the church. And you're wondering, what's ahead? Or maybe, because this is Patriotic Sunday, maybe you're looking at some of the serious challenges that are confronting our country, and you're a little worried about the future, whatever it is, may I encourage you this morning to hold in the back of your mind that simple truth. Jehovah Jireh, the Lord will provide. And then move forward with faith and confidence. How can I be so sure that God will provide? Because God's name is Jehovah Jireh. And God always lives up to God's name. And that, my dear brothers and sisters, is the good news for this morning. Our closing hymn is hymn number 696, America the Beautiful. We're going to stand and